images and start thinking about where are the Indians in this? Where's the small farmer in Brazil in this? And the answer is nowhere to be seen. It's, in a sense, testimony to the macroeconomic development of Brazil at a very successful scale, which nobody would argue against. But you also, when you look at these kind of images, you have to start thinking about what else went on in this area and who lost out as other people gained, and so on. And that becomes a theme that we take up more when we discuss the Amazon basin, Amazon development, not so much this week as starting next week. Good. So I want to talk today then about this sort of opening up of the center-west of Brazil, and especially begin by dealing with the movement of Brazil's capital for the second time, right, from Salvador in the colonial era down to Rio in the 18th century, and then ideas about moving the capital into the interior. Perhaps it's wise to begin by thinking a bit about general patterns of Brazilian urbanization. How much has been planned, how much has been spontaneous? Brazil as a whole, I would think that the overall emphasis tends to be on spontaneous. If one thinks about, just have a clip around about the growth of Sao Paulo in the 1940s, you get this notion of huge rural-urban migration beginning out of northeast Brazil. It's not something being steered by city authorities, by government. When we come in the next class to think about favelas in Rio de Janeiro and the scale of them today, something on television at the weekend that I happened to catch, talking about pacification in favelas. Funny word, pacificação. What does, in Portuguese, what does it mean? Basically getting everyone to settle down, trying to get some kind of control over illicit arms activity and stuff like that. And you watch this interviewer, youngish woman, speaks very good Portuguese, not where she's from originally, not from Brazil, maybe from Brazil, I don't know, but going with the special police and so forth into some pretty tough environments. And in the last few years, Rio, the city authorities, the federal government has been trying harder to do something about conditions in favelas, but the total number that they sort of tackled in this manner so far is maybe a couple of dozen maximum, and you're talking about something like 400. Before the coming Olympics, they have this idea that somehow all is going to be sweetness of life in the favelas. We talk about them more in the next class, but they're a good example of spontaneous activity in urbanization, people solving their own housing issues rather than something planned, something formal. But having said that, there are examples of places in Brazil that represent the notion of planned urbanization. Maybe one can sort of improve conditions by starting new cities and organizing them in ways that get around certain social and economic obstacles. So oddly enough, in the center-west, well, the best earlier example, it comes from the state of Minas Gerais, which used to have as its provincial capital the place Ouro Preto. Anybody know anything about Ouro Preto? These Baroque towns in the hills of Minas that in the era of the mining, when you had vast amounts of gold and silver coming out of those hills, Europe's largest single source of valuable metals for currency purposes in the days when we didn't have paper money and gold and silver was everything. Vast wealth was flowing out of Brazil, alas, mines that were worked predominantly by slave labor, and you had these Baroque colonial era towns with great divisions of wealth, with the elite living in rather beautiful colonial era houses. These are all now tourist destinations. Anybody wants to go to Brazil? Obviously, I don't know what's on your travel agenda. Probably Rio de Janeiro is high on most people's lists, at least starting out. But I have never set foot in Minas Gerais, which I find kind of amazing considering how long I've worked on Brazil. I never seem to find the time to travel enough in that country. It will come soon. But Minas Gerais would be an interesting place to go to. Well, fine, you have this kind of modest-sized colonial era city. That doesn't really suit modern day needs of industry and service and administration planning and so on. So the Mineiros, the people from Minas Gerais, founded in the late 19th century a new state capital called Belo Horizonte. Prosaic, nice horizon. And Belo Horizonte was very much a formally planned city starting in the 1890s. They laid it all out in a certain specific morphology with broad avenues and things like that. If you were to go and find maps of present-day Belo Horizonte, today it's one of Brazil's largest cities, you can still see in the formal core, in the core of Belo, you can still see the vestiges of the original formal planning, but the rest of the city has grown up quickly in the 20th century to kind of dwarf the planned area. Nevertheless, it's a good example of Brazilians do have a history of urban planning. And then in the 1930s, in 1937, Belo Horizonte was from 1898, by the way, they come up with Goiânia, which is the state capital of Goiás. These are parts of Brazil that nobody really thought about, talked about to any extent until not that long ago, down to about 1960 or so. They were pretty much off the radar screen. Not that many people lived in the Center-West. It's largely about some mining, some cattle raising. There were still significant presences of indigenous people in certain limited parts of the Center-West. Well, they moved the state capital of Goiás to a new planned city, Goiânia, in 1937. But that's all, in a sense, relatively small scale in comparison with the national capital idea. And the notion of Brazil moving into national capital is also something that's a little bit more deep-seated than the sort of modernist project that actually occurred in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So what I'm saying is that the intellectual roots of the idea of moving a capital away from the Atlantic coast into the interior are quite deep. Probably deeper than I know enough about, as I stop to think, who is the first person who suggests that it's a good idea to kind of move the capital away from the Atlantic coast? I don't actually know. I do know that by the beginning of the Old Republic, which if you remember, I said was quite loosely modeled on the federated system of the American Republic, it was technically, literally, the United States of Brazil, the Estados Unidos do Brasil. They have a new constituent assembly. They're sort of thinking out a new vision for Brazil, a new constitution, giving powers over to the states, decentralizing to a certain amount. But they also, in that period, start to do a certain amount of serious work, thinking about perhaps it would be a good idea to move the capital away from the relatively crowded Atlantic into the grossly undersettled interior. And they do a certain amount of preliminary planning work that doesn't really go anywhere practical. And then the idea comes up again under Vargas after 1930. There's a certain amount of increased involvement of federal government in a planning sense, especially after 1937. The Estado Novo in corporatism comes in from various parts of the world, especially Italy, has its impact in Brazil, and Vargas comes up with the notion of the March to the West. The March to the West, o Marcha para o Oeste. This, in a sense, thinking about the equivalent in Brazil of America's manifest destiny, that the American nation filled up its interior in the 19th century. Why shouldn't Brazil think about doing the same? A lot of it has geopolitical underpinnings that aren't so visible as they will become after 1964, but they're already there. In the 1930s, the giant of South America economically was not Brazil as it is today, it was Argentina. And so people in Rio, military people especially, are always wondering about what are the Argentinians up to in relation to their neighbors, Paraguay, Bolivia, the development of space in the interior of South America. It's in the 1930s but the Brazilians decided it's absolutely imperative to build a railway line that runs across here through Campo Grande in Mato Grosso do Sul to the Bolivian border, which could have a spur line and sort of feed into Paraguay as well. That's partly about integration space, it's partly about building up the economy, it's also partly about what do we do if we need to remove troops quickly from the Brazilian coast, the capital, into the interior in case any of our neighbors, especially thinking of Argentina, turn aggressive. So I can sort of recreate that world of the 30s. Doesn't really amount to huge amounts of movements of people yet, but there's a certain amount of intellectual thinking about Brazil should do more to occupy its interior. And maybe it's a good idea to move the capital eventually. And that thinking goes further at the end of the Second World War. Some of the research I'm doing at the moment involves a geographer who went into exile out of Germany in 1937, stripped of his post, comes to the United States, has a nice time, not really. It was hard teaching when you didn't speak English. In World War II at Wisconsin-Madison, in very large classes, while the tenured faculty disappeared to do secret war work in Washington. Then the peace comes around and there's no way forward for this person, so he goes to Brazil and works at the National Council of Geography in Rio de Janeiro. And one of the jobs they give this person is to head up one of several commissions to go into the interior and examine certain specific areas and figure out where the ideal place to locate the capital is. They had various notions. They were considering even certain portions of territory in the sort of western margins of Minas Gerais, even, which is still south central or southeastern Brazil. And there was a general who got himself heavily involved in what the geographers were doing, who said, you should just put it in the dead geographical center of Brazil, just like that. Figure out which is where. Somewhere up in northern Mato Grosso, I suppose, somewhere way further north and way further west than the actual location of Brasilia. And the social scientists, the planners, the geographers said, no, this just is utopianism to an extraordinary degree, that any new capital ultimately has to link in with existing infrastructure. You have to be able to get there by road, by rail, by air has been the great savior of Brazil. So one of the key locations to start thinking about is various locations in the state of Goiás, and eventually it becomes a reality. What is it like? Well, you know, that's where YouTube comes in handy. If you want to get a sense of the center-west of Brazil, I guess the most striking thing is that it's this huge plateau area that runs on for mind-numbing distances. It's not exciting if you're driving in a car. I'm not saying that there aren't regionally, locally, landscape features that are interesting. There are, but overall it's a pretty uniform sort of landscape. With some pluses, it's a very good climate. Most of Brazil has a pretty decent climate, but it's relatively moderate in the interior of Brazil. It's like living in sort of California sunshine to a large extent, all year round. And from an economic point of view, in terms of modern day mechanized agriculture, it's relatively flat, so it lends it. John Deere Corporation loves it, right? And all these US and other machinery manufacturers. It's a great place to be able to think about large scale farming. And overall, it's a place that has been greatly transformed in a relatively short period. So the actual building of Brasilia, what's it about? It's partly this notion of trying to sort of shift the concentration of population in a limited part of the country. It's also something that had very, very great symbolic value. It was trying to somehow change the perception of the past. The past is always in the East, the future is in the West. An idea that, you know, strikes a chord here, for some at least, in the United States. About 9 out of every 10 Brazilians live within 200 miles of the Atlantic coast. And by World War II era,